Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Penny Noss, and welcome to the first in our series of TradeExperettes events on modern supply chains. We have in British, I guess, a bang-on panel of absolute experts talking about, and frankly, I don't know where you could find people that are more expert than the people we have on this call today on supply chains. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I want to thank PepsiCo and Global Affairs Canada. They've helped to make this event possible and are also helping to support the TradeExperettes, an organization of approximately 500 trade experts from around the world who care deeply about the issues of trade and believe trade can be a force for good. So for today's event, we're going to use all of this fantastic expertise on the line to help us understand why supply chains are so complex. Can they be simplified? And if so, what are the pros and cons of those approaches? And to think about how does the intersection of government and the private sector work when it comes to supply chains and reconfiguration, simplifications, various things that are going on. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to ask them each a series of questions, and then I'm going to turn to all of you in the audience. So please think of your questions, put them in the chat or the Q&A function. And we will try to weave those in as we go. So first off, we've got Phil Levy. I think, Phil, how new are you still in your new position?
Pretty new. I joined the bank this summer.
Okay, so we're getting Phil kind of with fresh insights as the lead trade economist at the World Bank. Previous to that was the chief economist at Flexport, which is where, Phil, I saw you and heard a lot of your insights in the past. So second, we have Shumei Lin, who is the VP for Corporate Affairs at UPS and has been a real guiding force on a lot of the supply chain issues for a while, but in particular in APEC, where I know she's done quite a bit of work on supply chains, and I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more about those today. So thank you, Shumei, for joining us as well. Third, we have Ed. And Ed, I've known you for a long time, and I have to admit, I've never actually figured out how to say your name 100% correct. So I'm going to leave you to say it so I don't slaughter it.
No problem.
So Ed is the VP at the U.S. Consumer Technology Association and is a former USTR and former Department of Commerce official. And I know that the Technology Association and electronics devices in general have very complicated supply chains, and they also have very interesting ideas in terms of how to think about supply chains in today's world. And we have Myra Souza, who is a TradeExperettes member. And I think of Myra as being one of the foremost experts on trade and compliance, currently with the International Flavors and Fragrance Association. And Myra, are you still beaming in from Baku, or are you back in Europe at this stage?
I'm just back.
Okay.
Yesterday.
Okay. So you have fresh insights from there. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panel. And Phil, I'm going to have you kick us off. So can you, given your vast experience, and I would just love to get your perspectives on what are some of the basic principles and concepts we need to know and to understand about today's modern supply chains? And if you could also share a little bit about what you think the current state of play is in the world today around supply chains. After pandemic and after a lot of other things, people are talking about how supply chains might be reglobalizing, deglobalizing, fragmenting. Would love to hear your perspectives on that. So with that, Phil, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and that's a lot. So let me start the way you did it, because I think there are some maybe principles, and we'll see if my colleagues here agree with me. But I thought I'd lay out some principles for how one might think, but and answer this very good question of why are supply chains as complex as they are. So I'll give you 4 principles. One, often we mistake distance for complexity. And I would say that in supply chains, you don't want to think about distance as how the crow flies. You might want to think about it more like how airlines fly, in the sense that you can often find that getting from one far-flung point to another is actually pretty fast as long as you got a direct flight. That's what they do. You're great. Whereas someplace that's close, if you got to make a bunch of connections and there's infrequent flights, it's the crow would get there fast. The airline isn't going to get you very fast. That happens in supply chains too, which means that a lot of this craze for nearshoring, you might think, well, if we're in El Salvador, it's clearly a lot closer and easier to get to the US than it is to get from Shenzhen, for example. Not necessarily true. That, going across the Pacific, you've got the Trans-Pacific eastbound trade lane, one of the biggest ones there is. So think of that as the big express route that runs all the time. So I guess that's one principle, is that you got to be a little bit careful how you think about distance. Second one, if I had to give, and this is actually probably the biggest reason why I think supply chains are the way they are, there's intense competition out there. That companies that are trying to make money are really pressed to expand margins. And so if somebody says, we've got these 10 steps to making our product, and if we take a couple of them and we move them over here, I think we can shave 2 or 3% off our costs. Well, 2 or 3% off your costs may not sound like a lot, but that could be a lot for what happens to margins. And I think that's how these things have developed, is that there's pressures, and if you don't do it, a competitor does, and then you've got various things. So that's the second thing. Intense competition is what drives this, not ideology or some love of having conversations across distant time zones and waking up early or staying up late. Third thing, which I think sometimes gets lost in these discussions, there are really substantial price differences among countries, even if you look among developing countries. That I think there's sometimes a sense of, well, we didn't like dealing with this country, so you should really just switch to another. That may not be on offer. So at Flexport, there were occasions talking to clients, where one particular instance sticks out. Somebody was trying to decide whether or not to move from China to Mexico to avoid a looming 25% tariff. As they priced it, producing their particular good in Mexico is going to be about 23% more expensive. So very slight gain, but that's illustration. It's not just pick one and you're fine. This can come either from what are the characteristics of the country, comparative advantage, or it can just come from specialization, where somebody has specialized and therefore gotten the returns to scale and has very low costs. Last one, I would say, is rearranging supply chains is costly, both in time and money. And that's why this company was worrying about this, because you might say, well, what the heck, if it's 2% you save it, just switch and you can switch back. It's not that easy. That often you need to certify a supplier, you need to do other things. And so one of the implications of this is, as we look at what's happened during recent turmoil, maybe upcoming turmoil, one of the things is that companies are having to make some of these decisions based on their expectation of what's coming over a period of years. It's not the kind of thing that each quarter you switch a supplier. So that makes life very challenging on this. All right, you really want me to give, so quick opinions. Decoupling, nah, superficial. De-risking, not really. There's plenty of risk out there. Reglobalizing, we didn't deglobalize.
Well, there you go. And maybe we'll dig into those on the next round. So on the decoupling, reglobalization, deglobalization. Thank you. And I love those principles. I love the points that you have there. And I indeed think that changing supply chains not only costs money, but there's expertise and practices and procedures that go into supply chains nowadays, that shifting requires all new cost, compliance, verifications, et cetera, that come in. So I think those are 4 fantastic principles. Thank you for that, Phil. Shumei, so you've been the architect of the APEC Business Advisory Committee Supply Chain Principles. And so in that setting, would love to hear some of the key points that you would share, maybe building on what you've heard Phil say. And I think recently you did a study on helping businesses build and maintain open, secure, and resilient supply chains. So would love to capture your insights.
Thank you, Penny. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope nobody in Asia is up right now, but good evening if you are. Yeah, first of all, Phil, really loved what you had to say. I feel like your, what you've been describing is really a very practical insight into business, and that is indeed what we were trying to do at the APEC Business Advisory Council, which UPS was fortunate enough to be part of these past 2 years. For those of you who are not familiar with APEC, APEC is the 21 economies of the Asia Pacific region. It includes the US, China, several Southeast Asia economies, Northeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and to make it very interesting, Russia's in there as well. And APEC is the Business Advisory Council, right? So it represents the business leadership of the 21 economies, kind of like the B20 version of the G20. In the last 2 years, we started on this work on supply chain resilience because I think, like many of you, I think we came out of COVID-19 feeling like we had just fought a war. But we didn't think too many governments learned any lessons from the great supply chain disruption that caused this great economic loss. And two, as you all know very well, today we have a lot of governments telling us how to reorganize our supply chains in the name of resilience. So we felt like it was really time to time out and to bring back the voice of business. Supply chains, after all, is the business of businesses, not the business of government. And if we were to build resilience, we are going to have to do it together. So I think that was the premise under which we started this work. So I think one of the things that we're really proud of, and and Phil talked about this earlier, is sort of the real world stories of businesses need to be told, right? So educating governments on what went wrong, showing them how their action created operational failures and paralyzed business networks, and just talking generally about how it is that supply chains are organized. Why is it that they're organized this way? From the stories of the lead firms we documented, we also learned what worked for them. And we can talk about that a little bit later. I'll give a couple of examples, what didn't work for them. And I think those stories in itself are so important because as small businesses think about their own supply chain, how they want to be more resilient, they can learn a lot of these stories from these lead firms that we interviewed. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One example is speaking to the value of partnerships and resilience. So one big US grocery chain that we interviewed was able to respond really well because they felt like the diversity of partnerships in their supply chain allowed them to do that, while a healthcare company, also highly regulated like the food sector, but with highly verticalized supply chains, and healthcare companies, that they try to verticalize because it's really important for them to maintain strict safety and regulatory compliance. They were very vulnerable. So, and that sort of speaks to when you're in a crisis, it's not about how much you own, it's about the partners and friends that can help you out during a crisis. So I thought that was a really important example. We have a couple of others that I can share later on. In the second year, we started looking into critical supply chains. So of course, everyone now is thinking, okay, these supply chains are critical to my economy, and so therefore we need to do something about it. And governments, you saw in the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, they're talking about how to build resilience in some of these critical supply chains. So what we felt was we needed to drill in a little bit more into the specific supply chains. After all, they're all different. And in our case, we drilled in a little bit more into the healthcare supply chain, which, as I mentioned early on, is rather vulnerable. And we discovered that actually, there's a lot that governments can still do to make them more resilient, separate from onshoring and essential medicines lists, et cetera, that we saw in Europe, and I think the United States is also looking at it again. One of the main takeaways after speaking to healthcare companies, and I'll end here, is that in the Asia Pacific region, where the markets are small and fragmented, we really need to continue to maintain a very open model. Large markets like China, EU, and the US might be able to be self-sufficient, but in APEC, to get supplies of critical medicines and vaccines and medical devices, and importantly, to address access to medicines and patient needs, we really need each other. The instinct is to stockpile and to hoard, but for governments, the cost of hoarding and the wastage involved, we saw this during the pandemic, is something that I think is not sustainable moving forward. So more to be done on this, and we hope to have more conversations about this on supply chains at APEC. But the point is that we need to have these conversations, right? Otherwise, governments are making decisions in a silo a little bit. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Penny.
Thanks so much, Shimei. I think one of the things that I take away from what you're talking about is the importance of trust too between partners, whether it be government or whether it be the private sector and the public sector coming together. There needs to be that either trust or some mutually assured destruction if they don't do something that comes into play. So super interesting. Thank you for that. Ed, I'm going to turn to you next. I know that the electronics, consumer technology industry is probably thinking a little bit about their supply chains at the moment, given the possibility that tariffs may be coming to some of your supply chains in the coming months. So would love to hear, how are you helping your companies think about supply chains, and also how are you thinking potential alternative destinations for investment for some of these reconfiguring supply chains? How are you counseling those countries on what they need to be thinking? Maybe again, building off what Phil and Shimei have been saying in their presentations.
Well, thank you, Penny, and thank you to TradeExperettes for inviting me to speak at this important webinar today. It's a real pleasure. I'm a big fan of the TradeExperettes, so the honor is all mine. Look, we've been dealing with supply chain issues in the consumer technology industry for many years, really since the onset of the Section 301 tariffs on imports from China in 2018 and 2019. And that was really the clarion call for companies to start determining whether they should move their supply chains out of China. We did a lot of studying of the effect of the tariffs on our industry in 2022. And what we found was many supply chains, but not all, did move out of China into third countries. We also found that the tariffs did not lead to more manufacturing in the United States or increased employment in the consumer technology industry in the United States. As a matter of fact, it probably led to less employment. So since the beginning of this year, even into last year, I feel like I've been Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. I mean, I've been saying tariffs are coming over and over and over again. And I want my member companies to understand that this is real. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of how high, how fast. I mean, what is the wall really going to look like when it comes to tariffs? Is it going to be across the board or on specific countries? We feel like we have to take the president-elect seriously and literally, that when he says, I want to impose a 60% or higher tariff on all imports from China, that he wants to follow through with that threat. That's a campaign promise he made. When he says he wants to impose a 10 or 20 or even 50% universal baseline tariff on all imports from all countries, we're going to take that seriously. I can't tell my member companies just to dismiss it as campaign bluster. So the challenge here, though, is that many companies said, okay, we'll move our supply chains out of China into places like Mexico or Vietnam or Thailand or Taiwan, Malaysia. I mean, it's a long list. I would say Mexico and Vietnam probably are the primary beneficiaries of the Section 301 tariffs. So companies have made their bets, but if they get hit by a universal baseline tariff, then those bets don't look very good anymore. And they were trying to do the right thing, and all of a sudden they're getting penalized for doing the right thing. The other challenge here is that these tariffs, no matter how they're imposed, are going to lead to price increases. We did a study in October on possible 10% ring around the US tariff plus a 60% flat tariff on all imports from China on top of that. And what we found was that for key consumer technology products like smartphones, laptops, and tablets, and video game consoles, the price increases would be significant. And there is no substantial production outside of China for those items that would be able to supplant that Chinese production at this point. To move all of that production out of China to other countries would be very costly and time consuming. There's no guarantees you'd get to the right levels of quality, or you'd be able to hit the right price points. So the supply chains in China are highly efficient and organized, and there's tremendous logistical support there. It's hard to replicate that environment outside of China, and it's certainly hard to move it back to the United States. I worry that this all tariff all the time approach is really going to undermine U.S. competitiveness. It's going to harm consumers. And we're just trying to help our members understand what's to come. I mean, if the idea is we're just going to go after every single country that has a trade surplus with the United States, well, that means that every country that we import from, like Vietnam and Mexico, they're going to get hit with tariffs, or other Southeast Asian countries. I mean, that's the goal for the Trump administration, is to reduce trade deficits and move manufacturing back to the United States. So there are no real good bets here if everybody's going to get hit with a tariff. And to move all your production back to the United States is not feasible. It's not desirable, because it would lead to retaliation by our trading partners, and it would create a lot more chaos in the world. And as we all know, the last thing that companies want is chaos and uncertainty and unpredictability in supply chains, and certainly in the business climate. And to Shumei's point, companies value resilience in a very different way than governments, and they don't want unpredictability because that undermines their resilience. So any new policy action like tariffs is anti-resilience.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for those comments. I think we had a question come in, and I think you've partially answered it. We'll dig into it maybe a little bit more with Phil in terms of what are the most exposed, and can you move to certain new markets? And if so, what products can and can't shift? And I think you've answered a lot of that about your industry, and that the ecosystem that exists for any of us that have ever been to Shenzhen or some of the other big places in China that do a lot of this manufacturing, the ecosystem that exists would be difficult to replicate or pick up and immediately move, just given the totality of the ecosystem. So thank you so much for that. Myra, you're fresh back from Baku and working for, and I want to clarify, a manufacturing company. International Flavors and Fragrance is a manufacturing firm. And I know you have an extensive background in kind of the chemicals, other industries. We've heard Ed talk about his industry. We've had Shumei give a few examples of a couple of other industries. But I would love to hear your perspective on beyond tariffs, just coming out of Baku and thinking through some of the other things that are in the world and shaping the world today, which is climate and decarbonization. Would love to get your perspective on how these other factors are also being taken into account for certain supply chains, and how they may or may not be impacting the complexity or the simplification that's going into supply chains due to the efforts to decarbonize in certain markets, as well as the access to energy.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you, TradeExpress, for having me today. So indeed, I'm just back from Baku, still recovering my energy level because it has been quite intense. So absolutely, the first thing I would say is that according to Carbon Brief, 2024 is going to be the first year that will be above the 1.5 degrees Celsius of climate. So this says a lot that impacts all of us in all different aspects of it. So I will start by saying that trade has been definitely being recognized now as part of these negotiations. So we had about 2 weeks ago, COP16 Colombia, Biodiversity COP, where we had the first trade day ever. And now in COP Baku, so the climate COP, trade had its second time ever as well, trade day. We even had a group of African countries, for example, already sharing positions that some of the measures being put to fight climate change, and they're actually protectionist in view of trade, and then trade should be really brought into the table and the negotiations. But I have to say that some of the organizations such as the WTO, UNCTAD, ICC, they're doing a great work there on the ground. So they also have a pavilion and COP, for example. I had a panel just 2 days ago about bioeconomy and what was the role for trade on that. In fact, how we do have technological solutions, right? They are more friendly compared to the fossil fuel-based counterparts. But we also need the trade tools to work to make sure that we can cross border with these products that are bio-based, that are friendly, sustainable products, to make sure that we help in this green transition and then replace fossil fuel-based ones. So I see this really increasing trade being taken into account in those conversations, the same as well for forced labor. And then if one other thing, just the last one on COP, is actually that we're still seeing the negotiations, but one of the achievements so far has been on the Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreements. The negotiators at least agreed in establishing a global carbon market. As we have been talking about CBAM, carbon border adjustments, and so on, this is already a great development, I would say. But if I go a bit more into like talking about national or regional examples, I can mention about EU, of course. I'm Brazilian, but based here in the EU with a global function, so we're seeing everything. But if I take EU, we have seen that the EU Green Deal has been established with the previous commission, right, in 2019. And with that, over 50 different policy, so measures to embedding the sustainability principles, right? And then some of them heavily impacting trade, such as the UDR, CBAM, due diligence directive, and so on. So what we have seen is that this really pushed us with these industrial policies into industrial practices. So there is clearly a mindset shift there in the way we operate as companies really taking a sustainable model. So we are looking into things, the eco-design of a product, traceability, decarbonization in the defossilization, transparency, and so on. So it's really like cross-functional if I think of terms of supply chain, things responsible sourcing, how is the production, right, carbon emissions and so on. Putting this all into perspective. So I see there are a lot of opportunity and there are, of course, a lot of challenges because this is really like fragmented. So sometimes those policies, they are incoherent. Is a patchwork and they're all coming at the same time. And then we see lots of different ideas, initiatives, for instance, what is the sustainable criteria of a product, right? I think sometimes we need to step back and work in some of the definitions, because if we have a different indication of what is considerable as sustainable goods, we may even hinder some of the investments that are done. If I take an example of biopolymer, for instance, here in the EU, we do face some challenge like that. Also some challenges like the famous process production methods, right? What are we looking, what is sustainable, how is it being produced, and so on. But what I wanted to say is that we all have been looking into the life cycle assessment now to what is considered a sustainable product. This really became important. It is important that we keep nurturing the local ecosystem and preserving as well the nature, because we can also make a longer benefit from it, but taking these parameters into account. So I would say sustainability has come to stay, is not going away, is really embedded now in the industrial practices that we have to deal for. We still need, as I mentioned, more trade tools to deal with it, because even if you look at some of the WTO agreements, is not fit for purpose for environment or even from the human rights side, right? So just a bit more on the human rights side as well. I have also worked with the World Economic Forum, and a report has been published early this year in some policy recommendations. Once again, we see a lot of fragmentation there. We have different international organizations with different conventions about forced labor, human rights, child labor, and so on. And we have three main recommendations there, of course, is for harmonization standards, and why not could be like one of the channels legally binding with when you take the transnational corporations guidelines. At the UN Human Rights Council, we also talk about to step back and have a supply chain lens to it, and then help especially developing countries with capacity building, enforcement, and cooperation, really among others. So I will stop here, but that's basically like, because I could go on, but I will stop here in terms of time. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a couple questions come in, so I'm going to weave them in as well as cover a couple of things. So Phil, I want to come back to you on this. And in particular, we've had a couple of questions come in. Would love to hear you explain a little bit more. No decoupling, no de-risking, no reglobalization, because we haven't deglobalized to begin with. And, you know, I feel like that there's micro level examples around how supply chains have been reconfigured or people maybe rethinking it. But at the macro level, is what you're seeing that this really isn't a trend that has come in? And if not, what are the other factors that are coming into play?
Yeah, I believe that was what was called laying down a marker on my part. So yes, so I was being provocative. It is certainly true. It depends what measure you want to look at. If you want to look and say how many imports are, what share of US imports are coming from China, yeah, you've seen a decrease in that. That has moved. There's no doubt it has. If you look overall at things like what's happened to the ratio of trade to GDP in the world, it hasn't fallen as much dramatically. And so there's a bit here where it's, well, what is our measure of globalization? So if you want to say, well, we deglobalized, now we're going to reglobalize, you have to be a little careful. Things have gotten shuffled around this way. De-risking, we'd have to talk about what risking meant. I think frequently what has been meant when people said de-risking or decoupling was that either one was, well, one way or another, that companies were insulated from geopolitical conflict or disagreements with China that might then sort of cut off supply chains. There's a bunch of ways you could think about that, other sorts of interruptions, disease, of course, natural events. The trick on this is that it's still the case that we very much keep our trade statistics in a convenient but misleading way. So if a good is finished in China, even if it were made 80% in Malaysia, it counts as a Chinese good. And the reverse is true as well. If you have a good that's made 80% in China and finished in Malaysia, it counts as a Malaysian good. When you have the kind of tariff discrepancies that Ed was talking about, and that we're being threatened with more, there's a really strong incentive to do that, to actually make supply chains more complex in this way. Because if you had a good that was 100% made in China, but you now, instead of doing that last step in China, you finish it, you do a substantial transformation somewhere else. If you had bilateral tariffs, then you would avoid those tariffs. And that's, I think, some of what has been, we've been seeing in Mexico and Vietnam, as he talked about. That may sound like it's evasion, but it really, and evasion would be if you had a completely Chinese good and you just mislabeled it as something else. Here, this is the way we've set up the rules of the system. The nationality of a good, I'm not going to pretend to be a customs expert, but for the most part, you do a substantial transformation on that last step, and that's where it picks up its national identity. So not a big deal when you're doing even-handed tariffs across everyone, MFN, but a very big deal if you have bilateral tariffs, or if you have a discrepancy where it's 60% on one country and 10% on another. So how is that an answer to the decoupling? Because has one actually decoupled if maybe you're not getting the final transformation happening in China, but earlier stages are happening. It's still the world's second largest economy. So the question is, so the two ways that you might ask the question, well, you might come up with more. One is, how many imports are we getting directly from China? Fewer than we did before. That part's clear. Have we worked China completely out of our supply chains? If you're the US, think about this. No, you haven't. So that was what was behind my answer.
Yeah, I think it just shows that sometimes when you're trying to decomplexify a supply chain, you actually sometimes may end up making it more complex with moving to, I know a lot of companies have moved to a China plus one strategy that may actually be kind of the same thing, just with certain things kind of being a tourist in another country on their way into the US to a certain extent. So
I think it's an example of one of Shumei's points, if I recall correctly, which is that you set out to do one thing and you have to be very careful about how this actually plays out in the business world.
Yeah, exactly. So Shumei, do you have a reaction to that? And also, I did want to kind of poke you a little bit on a lot of when we talk about supply chains, it's about goods, but there's, in our societies, 10% is manufacturing and 85% is services, with the rest being agriculture and some other things. So just query, how does services fit into this picture as well?
Thanks for that question, Penny. Let me marinate a little bit on Phil's points, but I do recall, Phil, if we start to look at the percentage of intermediate goods that are coming out of, that originally were coming out of other Asian markets serving Chinese finished goods, the reverse has taken place. Now there's more intermediate goods going into other Asian markets and finished goods coming out of other ex-China markets. So, I think maybe a point to note that potentially none of it has really changed, right? It's just sort of people switching roles in the supply chain. On services. So I'll say, I think there's stuff to be done, to be said on services for sure. And for sure, a lot of work that governments still need to do besides thinking about how to reorganize our supply chains, right? Because as you all know, we're concerned about getting our stuff, but in the background, in the foreground, are a few critical services that bring this stuff to you. And here I'm talking about, of course, the enablers of movement of goods, whether it's logistics or e-payments or some of the business process services, customs clearance services. Services is a really important piece. Manufacturing services is what gets you your stuff. So I'm from UPS, so let me just talk about logistics and transportation. So you may recall at the height of the pandemic, when the world was experiencing that global traffic jam, in Asia, we had air and sea crew issues. Airports and seaports were operating at 30% capacity because we had this thing called closed loop management that we had to work within. And in the US, I think it was well described. I think Penny gave me this example first, Penny, that the kid during Halloween was wearing a T-shirt that said, "My Halloween costume is stuck on a ship at Long Beach." You remember that example. So the point here is, on a normal day, all this just comes together magically. Global trade is so dependent on this sort of intricate synchronization of transportation coming together like a dance without a whole lot of government intervention, right? And all it takes is one black swan event and the entire ecosystem is paralyzed. And so this might be one area that governments could perhaps start to study a little bit and think about how we can perhaps get better visibility of what those vulnerabilities are in the transportation ecosystem, and maybe put together some sort of regional cooperation framework that can address some of these vulnerabilities. That's something that you could do. Another point I'll say is, during the pandemic, remember, everyone was at home shopping online. So you know how important the e-commerce, or how important e-commerce is to all of us. And within e-commerce, of course, there are a number of services that bring all this together: logistics, e-payments, digital services. But one thing that we wanted to point out in the work that we did in APAC, we actually said, is that it's very easy to go online and to shop and click and put in that order, but the fulfillment part is still a very physical piece, right? You still need someone to do the production, the pick and pack, the loading, the transportation, the delivery. All that is just still very, very manual. And that part couldn't keep up with the demand. And so here again, maybe something to look at some of these services and make sure that they're, you put in more investment into automation, digitalization, in order to help us address that great mismatch that we had right during the pandemic. So those are just a couple of things I thought, important for governments to work on involving services. And really there's a lot to work on, and we shouldn't stop working on those traditional things that governments have always been talking about at APEC.
I mean, I think going back to Ed's point and Phil's point about the ecosystem you need around some of these manufacturing processes. I mean, you can't make a semiconductor if you don't have the calibration equipment and the testing equipment to make sure that the semiconductors are being created in a certain way. You need that conformity assessment, folks. I think, Shimei, your pharma example is a really interesting one, because I think about vaccines. If you didn't have the super cold chain warehousing capabilities, at least regionally, it was very difficult to do the vaccines. So again, warehousing and specialized warehousing becomes a need if you want to get into some of the manufacturing processes. So, and I think that's really important. And if you think about the electronic supply chains, one of the questions we've had come in is what else besides tariffs could you do to correct for global imbalances or to help encourage some of the things? I mean, maybe the diagnosis is right, but we don't like the way it's being executed. What would you do differently, or what would you advise policymakers on that front?
Look, first of all, forced localization measures are never the answer here. Like using the force of government to mandate companies to move production into the territories of countries, that is very inefficient. Companies aren't going to want to do that. It's harmful to small businesses and particularly startups. So what we are thinking about at CTA is a set of policy recommendations on how to diversify supply chains. And this would be recommendations to governments. And some of this is going to sound tried and true because, in fact, it is. So number one, reducing trade costs. If we're going to diversify supply chains out of China, if that's the ultimate goal here, governments around the world need to help companies reduce their trade costs, because China is still going to be very competitive in manufacturing. They have a great ability to scale up and to reduce costs for companies, which is the reason why a lot of companies would like to stay in China. So you could use trade facilitation measures. You could, if you're a developing country, or even a developed country, if you're not yet part of the information technology agreement at the WTO, acceding to that would help reduce trade costs for companies. It would reduce complexity. So that's number one. Number two is facilitating digital trade. I can't underscore how important this is. We need to have better approaches to digital trade, because physical trade can't happen now without digital trade, and the exchange of goods, the exchange of ideas, the exchange of intellectual property, information related to supply chains, all of that relates to digital trade. So we're highly supportive of the strong digital trade rules in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, for example, or the US-Japan agreement. I mean, there's other examples in the Asia-Pacific, like I think Singapore, Australia, UK is negotiating a lot of high standard digital trade rules. Having high standard digital trade rules of the WTO would make a lot of sense. Addressing data localization requirements. Those rules are not yet in the e-commerce JSI outcome. So that would all matter to supply chain diversification. Number three is regulatory alignment. Between close trading partners, if there's differing regulations or differing standards for products, that is costly. When companies have to design and then manufacture products for multiple markets, that reduces their ability to scale up and also is more costly over time. China is in a better position to make many products for multiple markets. They can just push aside that regulatory alignment concern. They have just so much scale that it's not a big deal for them. So number 4, I'm just going to rattle off a couple more. We also prioritize infrastructure, having sound and robust infrastructure, particularly with respect to logistics, is really important. Access to affordable sources of energy for manufacturing, highly important. Workforce is huge. In the United States, we have full employment. It's very difficult for companies to access skilled pools of labor. It's very costly. In other countries, they're focusing on reskilling their workforces, creating entirely new skills within their workforces, and this is critical to the diversification of supply chains. The last thing I'll mention here, and this is so important, is working with allies. No one country can do this by themselves. Allies have to work with one another. They have to have shared objectives. They have to work together to reduce trade costs. They have to work together to protect intellectual property rights. They have to uphold the rule of law together. When we see governments resorting to forced localization measures that are inconsistent with trade rules, that denigrates the rule of law. And so allies have to be cognizant of that. And I think joint projects, joint approaches to trade negotiations, this is all highly important. And the last thing I'll say here is free trade agreements do work. And that does help convince companies to diversify their supply chains if they have the backstop of a strong set of rules, an enforceable set of rules in a free trade agreement. Maybe the United States doesn't like the term FTA anymore, but other countries are still negotiating FTAs because they want to take advantage of this new phenomenon of supply chain diversification.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks on that point. I wanted to go back to something Shimei said about intermediate goods, because I was digging into some of the figures, and one of the questions is about US-EU and some of the supply chain interdependencies. And I mean, one of the things about US-EU trade data is that particularly the European exports to the United States, much of that is going into, much of that is intracompany transfers of intermediate goods. So it's a part being made in Europe that's then going over to be finished in a factory in the United States. And so really complex ecosystem there as well in terms of, is the motive that all of these intermediate goods start being made in the United States? If so, how's that going to work versus, those are parts going into U.S. factories with U.S. workers making finished products for the U.S. market. And there's some complexity to some of this and that's linked to jobs, that's linked to manufacturing, that I wonder if it hurts rather than helps in some cases on that. I actually,
comment there, Penny. I mean, this is so critical for the consumer technology industry because the inputs come from so many different countries, and they are assembled into subcomponents, then shipped to another location, assembled into components, and then eventually assembled into the finished goods.
Yeah.
Many of those subcomponents and components come from China still, and moving all that manufacturing back to the United States would be incredibly costly. There's not enough labor to do it, so we have to work with our allies to do that.
Yeah. Something that Myra and I both had to work on was Brexit, where you had auto parts moving back and forth between the continent to the UK and back 6-8 times. And once Brexit came, because each of those transactions were now going to be covered by VAT or tariff, potentially, it became a much more complicated supply chain. Phil, I wanted to bring you back in quickly, because there's a couple questions that I think are best answered by you. So one of those is, how should we think about the globalization of services? And are there, from your Flexport days and also from your World Bank gig, what are some of the factors that economists and others should be looking at in terms of determining the globalization of services? And then second is, what are your thoughts about regionalization, which is another point that came up out of the comments. So Phil, maybe if I can turn to you on those.
Sure, I'd be happy to say a word or two about this. We're seeing a lot of increased stuff in services. I think Ed made reference that sometimes you get services and goods linked. If you sell, for example, an imaging machine, but the processing of those images actually takes place somewhere else, you've sold the machine, but a lot of this gets governed then by regulatory frameworks, and the question is, do they all work the same way and work together? That's just, there's a broad range of things that people do for services. Logistics, as Shumei mentioned earlier, is another example of this. But no, it's a growing importance. It's a lot of what we do. It's opened up a huge number of possibilities, since you now can provide services from around the world. And for a lot of developing countries, it's a real opportunity that you can get in and do this without necessarily the full sort of capital investment that you might have elsewhere. Regionalization, I think that is perhaps a little bit overblown. That I think, there's been discussions of whether we have sort of geoeconomic fragmentation. It sort of sounds, intellectually appealing to trade economists who wrote papers on these things, and I was guilty of that once upon a time. Where okay, you've got Asia and the Americas, and you've got Europe, and look how cleanly it breaks. But that doesn't seem to be very much what's happened on a lot of these things, in the sense of, as Ed discussed, you get Chinese companies investing in Mexico, or we still see things moving around. I don't know that it's on an entirely regional pattern. A lot of times, the agreements that we have seen between developing countries don't have the outcomes that they might like. Not always, but because they're often aimed at selling to advanced markets, and so they're looking to see who is in there. So I don't know that there's some of this where you've seen regional agreements serve as sort of platforms to develop new standards and say, here's a way to do things, and so it can be a proving board. I don't think it's a great substitute for having a sort of viable international open rules-based order.
So the one question I was going to ask you was national security, because I think as more and more national security creeps into certain products, certain supply chains, that may de facto start maybe not moving to regional supply chains, but some kind of trusted ally supply chain. So you have the US, UK, Australia agreement where they're looking at kind of secure supply chains. And I wonder if that's an area that, maybe there's the supply chain data hasn't quite, and maybe the supply chains just aren't there yet in terms of where some of this national security stuff may take us.
Yeah, let me take off my World Bank hat for a second and just say a word about national security stuff. It gets tricky. I think one can raise some questions. I don't think we have a clear definition of what, where we delineate national security and non-national security issues.
Yeah.
There's an element of that where one can say, okay, if you're talking about missile technology, yeah, I get it. That's national security. I think at the WTO, the first national security exception that somebody claimed in the 70s was a Scandinavian country with footwear, because armies wear boots. And so it's and people eat food, and armies eat food. So where do you draw the line? And you get dual use questions. This is going to be a very tricky issue. You're right. And then the other thing is, I don't know that we always have a consensus among countries as to who's trusted and who isn't. So having the world sort of split up along the good guys and the bad guys, or our guys and their guys, is probably not as clean as it seems at first blush.
Yeah, as we've seen from Japanese steel, CFIUS approvals. So we're coming up on the end of our time. I just want to give you each 30 seconds to kind of offer any final comments. And Myra, I'm going to start with you. If any final thoughts?
Yes, so on the implementation, the review of customs trade, 2 comments. One linked to Shumei's own service. I have been researching, as part of a study I have conducted, that the scope of environmental service at the WTO agreement is still very narrow. So one of the asks is that there are some discussions, talks to expand that. So in terms of environmental service, there are a lot of a surge on the green customs initiatives at multilateral organization, national level. some in multilateral environmental agreements as well. And once again, what I wanted to say is like, I see fragmentation coming up once again. In terms of trends, a lot of single window, digital product passport, data. So Ed has mentioned about as well proprietary information. I see confidential business information also as a concern. A lot of data is requested. We don't know where this goes. AI, big data, authorities are also using this. It helps to simplify procedures, but I also have seen sometimes that it also provides some risk. Collating data shows up a name of a company that is actually not involved in the situation. In terms of green steel, I see the rise of climate litigation as well. And there are ways that we can tackle some of the issues. Critical raw materials has come again in the discussions. And once again, there are ways to work with secondary raw materials to tackle that. So as a company, I would be looking into this. And more in the general terms, I also have been working with the B20 trade and investment, where we also propose a few recommendations. And one of them, at least in terms of customs, was like, why not harmonize customs declarations, data, interoperability of data, exchange and so on. So I will just finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ed, final 15 seconds.
Look, I mean, I'll go back to where I started. Tariffs are coming. Everyone needs to prepare. They have to figure out alternative strategies. Everybody needs to advocate for transparency with governments on supply chain issues. It's incredibly important. And I think with the incoming Trump administration, calls for transparency will be fundamentally critical to dealing with what's to come.
Thanks, Ed. Shumei, last thoughts.
I was going to maybe get a little bit less macro and call for more digging into specific supply chains, specific sectors. So Ed, you have your paper for consumer tech. We have a paper in healthcare. I think we need to take these papers and have specific conversations with governments about the specific nature of the supply chain, right? And so I call for those of you on the call that are in businesses, maybe start thinking about how you can come up with something specific for your sector so that the conversations are a little bit more informed for the governments.
Great. And Phil, final comments.
Final comment is if policies are anything like people have been forecasting, we're going to see more complexity in supply chains, not less.
That's a fantastic ending point. My takeaways from this are that supply chains are shifting, but not as much as the press reports. There's some stuff happening, but not quite as much. There's multiple reasons for it, but some of the things that are driving it are going to make supply chains more complex, not less. Exact same point, Phil, I picked up from this. And let's dig into more specifics and look at some of the specific supply chains. You can't use a broad brush to paint all the different supply chains. Depends on the sector. So with that, I want to thank my fantastic panel. I hope everybody on the call got as much out of this as I did. I want to thank you all for spending an hour with us. Your time is really valuable, and I know you could be doing a lot of other things. Thank you for spending it with all of us and helping to enlighten us on this really interesting and informative topic. So again, thank you all for joining. Thanks everybody that's in the audience. Thanks for the great questions, and we look forward to the next time. Take care.